a lot about what you folks have been studying in this seminar. I believe it has to do with local history and local history resources.
Local history, resources, and architecture, great estates.
I want to speak to you about some local history resources today. And in particular, vernacular or folk architecture. And I want to try to tell you something about reading a cultural landscape, because there's really a wealth of information outside of the library, right out in plain view. But the problem is to learn to read it. And it's when you get into it, it's really fascinating. And I'm really sort of a dilettante at this. I'm no expert, believe me. I'm very interested in it, and I'm sure you have or you will find it very interesting too. It can be a lifelong study, and I've just scratched the surface. And that's, if you can get those books, you can learn quite a bit more, and then go on from there, because it's a relatively new field in this country. You know, everything exists in space and time, and everything has form. And these are the three most important components of material culture. I, as a curator, am a material culturalist. That is, I'm a material culture historian. I'm not only interested, I've been trained as a historian. I'm not only interested in the printed word, written word, you know, manuscript materials, imprints. I'm also interested in three-dimensional materials. And when you think of it, three-dimensional materials are materialized ideas. There's an illustration of a materialized idea on the screen right now. In fact, many materialized ideas. Architecture is fascinating because it's so complex. That such a building is such a complex artifact, and a building is an artifact just as a table or a chair is, or a pot. Except it's much more complex, and you can get into this artifact. You can actually move around inside of it. You can become surrounded by the artifact. But in this one artifact are many, many ideas. Just as, say, many ideas go into the making of a chair, many formal, informal ideas, learned ideas, innovative ideas go into making of a chair. Even much more so, many ideas go into the making of a building. I want to show you some house types initially this morning to show you the difference between formal architecture, academic architecture, and vernacular architecture. But I'm going to be dwelling mainly on vernacular architecture or folk architecture. Now, what makes folk and academic? Well, in buildings, and in other things too, folk or vernacular is created by people, usually unskooled people, who are working in their own traditions. That is, they are makers. Of course, we're mostly consumers today, but go back 100 or 200 years, and people were mostly makers. If they couldn't make it themselves, they darn well knew someone who could make it, and they had it made. Just as this house was made for Sir William Johnson. This is Fort Johnson up in the Mohawk River Valley in this state. A very formal, academic, Georgian, if you will, building. So vernacular ideas, traditional ideas, are passed down from generation to generation over long periods of time, and people usually don't question those ideas. At least they didn't back 100 or 200 years ago. Like the thinking was, if it was good enough for my mother or my father and my grandmother and my grandfather, it was good enough for me, and they would preserve those ideas in that tradition and pass them on to the next generation. In opposition to that kind of thinking, that kind of mindset, there's popular culture, which we're so surrounded with today. We're so imbued with, we're so permeated with today. Popular culture is widespread, and with the communication systems we have today around the world, I mean, we have international popular culture. Blue jeans are popular around the world today, in the Soviet Union as well as in Arizona. Building types today are mostly designed by architects, as this building was back in the 18th century. This is a building that was constructed from formally made plans after someone like Christopher Wren. Someone did a design book, and that design book, probably printed in England, was used on the Mohawk frontier in the mid-18th century to build this house, to design this house, built by local makers in the Mohawk River Valley. Of course, Sir William Johnson, who was the agent for the Crown to the Iroquois Nation. Very powerful figure, a very dynamic figure, that period in American history. Big burly Irishman, John Wayne type, if you will. Well, anyway, this is an 18th century example of popular culture, the Georgian style, which became very popular beginning with George I and went on right on in popularity, at least in this country, right on through George III, and even into the 19th century, the early 1800s, when it became federalized. It was still basically a Georgian house that is 2 full stories, 2 rooms deep, with a central hall on the first floor at least, and usually on the second floor too. A through hall, and I mean a hall, sometimes as wide as this room. A grand hall, not just a passage. Many vernacular houses have small passages, in the English tradition anyway, that went through a house, but not a hall in the sense that a Georgian house contained a hall. So remember that for a Georgian house, which was a very, very popular and influential house design in America, in North America, during most of the 18th century and into the 19th century, right up until the Greek Revival period, as a matter of fact. This is a local house over on 9G at North Park. It's a vernacular house. It's a vernacular Georgian house, if you will, because it's 2 full stories again. This one has a raised basement, which makes it probably a federal style house, but still a Georgian style, but only 1 room deep. And this is called, if you look at the gable end, it's called an I house, an I type house, because the gable ends, I don't remember the name of the architect who gave it that name, but it's popular among most vernacular architectural historians. An I house has a gable end that's reminiscent of an uppercase letter I. It's a very tall, narrow gable end. You find these throughout the Northeast United States, and they're very popular, and it's an English vernacular form, brought from England, and built pretty much here as it was there. This one, I haven't been in this house, but I believe it has, looking at it from the outside, looking at the fenestration, I think I saw the door open one day. I think it does have a central hall.
It's been made into apartments also.
I see.
It's multi-dwelling, and probably
Right.
there's 6 apartments, and they're broken up into little rooms.
Yeah, you can see there's a wing attached to this building on the east side.
The picture also looks a lot better than the house does, right? This is
Yeah, this picture is several years old, so there's a mix of, some of them are like a week old and some of them are several years old. So.
This is in Hyde Park? It's on 9G,
North Park,
across
on
from
9G.
North Park School. Oh, yeah.
Okay, notice it's stone probably, stuccoed over. Most 18th century, early 19th century houses, if they were stone, were stuccoed over. People today tend to take off any old plaster or stucco and expose a nicely colored stone, but that isn't the way it was done, because people, the weather being time being such in this area, people couldn't afford, back in the days of lime and sand mortar, to expose the bonding of their stones or bricks. So a lot of times, especially stone, they were covered over with stucco plaster. The thing I want to say is that that form, that I form that we just saw, can be built in stone, it can be built in frame, it can be built in brick. It doesn't matter what it's built of, it's still the same form. And form is the key. Form and variations of form are the key for in doing analysis of vernacular houses, because there are patterns in vernacular housing, just as there are patterns in academic buildings. Richardsonian architecture, for one, Georgian architecture. There are patterns, and we're all very conservative, even to this day, as liberated as we think we are. We're all very conservative. Americans are probably some of the most liberal people on the face of the earth, but yet we all have that fear of anarchy, and we still tend to be conservative, even with the mass media the communications we have today, transportation we have today, which still have a conservative bent. And that's the way we've always been, except back 100 or 200 years ago, because people were more isolated, they were more conservative, and they weren't constantly bombarded by popular ideas as we are today. This is the Amy House, another house form. This is out at North Clove, I believe, in the eastern part of Dutchess County. It was recently purchased, and hopefully it is being restored, I believe. In situ, on its original site, and thank goodness it was purchased, and this gentleman is working on it, having it restored now because it was about ready to go down the tube. This is an interesting house because the Amys were Palatine Germans, and I'll speak more about the Palatines a little later, who settled here in the early 18th century and migrated over to eastern Dutchess County, and this house has a 1740 date in the left-hand chimney, which has been left exposed. You always have to be suspicious of dates, because during the centennial period in this country, and even after, it was very popular to date things, because people were proud. They say, oh yeah, this deed dates from 1680, so therefore the house must have been built in 1680. That ain't necessarily so. But people are very proud that way because they own a property, they own a house, they want it to be superlative, so they tend to give it, the earliest date they can possibly find. It's romantic, it's very nice, I'm not knocking it, but you have to be suspicious and careful. And a thing about vernacular architecture is it's very difficult to date, because we're talking about traditions here, as I said, that have come down through many generations. And people 200 years ago were conservative, very conservative. And even when they knew about popular culture things, they still many times stuck to their traditional culture. And we still have pockets of that around this nation today. And it's fascinating, and there are survivals today of people who still stick to the old ways. Down in the Southern Mountains, the Foxfire series talks about that. About these earlier traditions that people, because they were isolated, not only geographically, but mentally, too. It's more than geographic isolation, it's also mental isolation. As I said, if it was good enough for my dad or my granddad, it's good enough for me. And that's very important, and it makes for a fascinating study. All right, the Amy House is basically, even though these people were Palatine Germans, it's basically a Dutch house. Now, one thing I haven't talked about in determining these forms is that field study is very important. You can't learn about these things generally from books, even though I've given you a very short bibliography. You can learn so much from books, but then you have to go out and look at the things, and this is what I'm involved in my work. I have to look at material things, three-dimensional objects, to learn more about them. I have to study them individually, and that's what has to be done with this kind of architecture. And it also has to be done with formal or academic architecture, too. You can't learn about it from books. You learn as you go, as you examine, as you analyze, as you record. And recording is very important. This is why I said initially I'm sort of a dilettante, because I don't do the recording I should do in regard to this kind of material culture. Mainly because it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of discomfiture to do it. I have done some of it. But a real gung-ho architectural historian will go out and measure every building. These buildings disappear practically monthly. As I said, this one was right on the brink of disappearing. And it's a very important vernacular house for this area. Okay, German people lived in it, but they had learned the Dutch influence at that time was so strong that whomever built it built more in a Dutch tradition than a German tradition. Now, maybe the Amys, I don't know that much about the Amy family. They might have come over with the first waves around 1710, and by 1740 they may have picked up, and a generation later, they may have picked up a lot of Dutch influence by that time. Plus, the person who built the house, if it wasn't the Amy family, it was probably a local, I would say local help to build it, was probably drawing on a Dutch vernacular repertoire, Dutch vernacular ideas. And again, when I say Dutch, it's really a misnomer because there are so many cultural influences involved in what we call Dutch culture. I mean, the Netherlands were the delta land of the Rhine River, and so many ideas, important ideas, influential ideas, came down the river from the hinterlands, from Switzerland, from Germany. from who knows where. A case in point, there's a family named Zabriskie. In fact, they built the mansion up at Bard College. In Otherwood, I believe. The Zabriskie family. They're originally, they came from Poland through Holland. So they were Poles who lived in Holland and then came to America. So there's a great cultural mix, ethnic mix in so-called Dutch culture. But anyway, this is a Dutch house. It's you go in the door. One door on this side. There were two originally. There's one door in opposition to this door on the other side, which has been flanked up, and another door has been added. Had been added probably in the 19th century. A mid-18th century house in stone and timber. The roof is, and of course, beams are timber. And I want to just compare this to a true German vernacular house down in Pennsylvania. This is the Herr house, built purportedly in 1719 right outside of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, recently restored. Andrew Wyeth, the painter, his mother was descended from the Herrs, so he has taken a great interest and has given quite a bit of money in the restoration of this house. And it's a fine vernacular Germanic house. Notice the central chimney, which isn't exactly in the middle of the roof. I mentioned recording. One of the most important things to do with houses is to do a measured floor plan. That's the key to analyzing, comparing vernacular architecture, or any kind of architecture, whether it's vernacular or academic. This type of house has the door at the right goes into a kitchen, and the kitchen runs the full depth of the house. The big chimney is the main cooking fire, contains the main cooking fireplace in that big kitchen. And then off of that kitchen, in this particular house, there were two rooms. One was a parlor, the best room in the house, and then there was a small rear chamber, a sleeping chamber, in this house. This was a large house for its day. It was a mansion, really, in 1719, because this was still a raw frontier of Pennsylvania at that time. And Lancaster really didn't get going until about the 1720s. So this was a raw frontier. It was still Indian, there were still Indians out there at that time.
And what's the date on this one?
1719. I just wanted to give this as an example of a true continental type. And I say continental, it's Germanic, but it has more influences than just the German influence. The house, the Amy house, is a Dutch house. It also has two, it's divided in half, about in the center, which is really, and it's a story and a half high, which is very Dutchy. And it has two rooms of almost equal size on the first floor. Usually the first floor is the key floor, and then the upstairs isn't quite as important for floor plan layout. So it doesn't have a central chimney. What they've done is, in the Dutch manner, they've moved the chimney to the end wall. The main cooking fireplace chimney. There's a huge yawning fireplace in this to the left, which I think would be the south end of the house. Originally it was another, a 19th century L attached to it, or wing attached to it, which was fallen down. The other fireplace was added much later, the chimney on the other end.
Looks like the construction, maybe it's the stone in this house is more brown, and the Amy it's more gray, and it looks like this has more cement in it or something.
Yeah, well, this is heavily restored, and again, you have to be suspicious of restorations, because architects, even fairly good architects, architectural historians, sometimes foist their own ideas on the object. That's very dangerous, and also sometimes they do irreversible things to the object, which is really taboo, and should be taboo. This house has a root cellar. The Amy house has a full cellar of the entire house, which is also a Dutchy thing. This house has a partial cellar, a vaulted root cellar on the far side. Another local house in sort of a composite, story and a half Dutch style, 2 rooms deep, symmetrical fenestration, symmetrical facade, with central door, side lights, probably probably early 19th century house. I don't know, I've never been in this one either. It doesn't have a central hall. It has a little vestibule that you go into. I know that, seen that, the door with the lights on it. With frieze windows, which is a Greek revival thing up in the half story, the upstairs, the upper part. Many of those were added later, quite a bit later in the construction of the house, and some were put in at the time of construction because, as I said, it's a Greek revival conceit. And they're not called eyebrow windows, by the way. They're frieze windows because they originally were in the frieze of the cornice of the house.
How do you spell that, please?
Oh, God. I-E-C-E, I believe.
C-E?
And again, it has, in vernacular buildings, you'll always find little lean-tos or little additions put on later on, or even at the same time, because it wasn't a formal type of plan. It was a generally informal, traditional type of plan. If people needed more room, they stuck something on. They really didn't worry too much about that. This is a good example of that. This house is on South Cross Road in Hyde Park, and it's a really good, and I've been through this house, owned by people named Calhoun. It's a good 18th century house to the right, a story and a half duchy type of house, 2 rooms deep, with a central entry. Not a through hall again, a stair hall, but just a vestibule type hall. And then this Greek revival addition that was probably put on maybe 1830s or 40s with, again, a country. It's sort of a vernacularized academic style. But people were trying to keep up to date, and that often happened with vernacular houses because they were being bombarded by popular ideas. And, and they would say, and they would build something, see something, or hear something in their travels or through books, through reading, and say, "Gee, I want to have one of those things." I want to fix my house up to look more up to date. So they would do it, say around 1800, when, especially during the Federal period in this area, you find many houses that are modernized, radically modernized around that time, around the turn of the century to 1800, and then. A problem would be that if there were ethnic people living in the neighborhood, they were still clinging probably more to their own forms, like Germans and Dutch people or whatever, French. And the English culture was the popular culture generally. That was really the strongest influence in popular culture was the English culture. So these English people, Yankees coming over from New England, would say, have their house types, and they'd say, you got to get up to date, man. And this, you can't have this old feudal looking stuff. We want, get with it. So the pressure was so great oftentimes that people would do something like this. Say, I'll show him. I'm just as up to date and just as modern as he is or she is. And it didn't only pertain to buildings, it pertained to a lot of other material culture too. So they would do this kind of thing, form an amalgam of ideas. Another Duchy Georgian house, this time a story and a half house. It should really be 2 stories to be a full Georgian house.
That's Adrian's house, isn't it? Right off of 9G,
Yes.
Little Road?
Yes, right. And I haven't been in this one either, so I don't know.
I have, that's lovely.
Does that have a central hall or does it have a
No, it's a vestibule.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, again, it's similar to the house I just showed you. This area up on 9G is a very rich area for material culture. And someone, maybe I will eventually, I don't know. Again, it's my sort of dilettante tendency. I haven't really spent the time. I'm usually traveling, down New Jersey. My home was originally in northern New Jersey, or down to Pennsylvania, or up to New England, hither and yon. But some of the best things are really close to home. It's that old saw, you find the best things in your own backyard.
Mrs. Adrian's would love to take you through there if you wanted to.
Oh, I'd love to. I'm not nerdy enough to just go knocking on people's doors, although I have done it occasionally. Notice the well house. The well was usually in close proximity to the house. And then beyond the house, beyond the well house, you see the gable of a farm building. And this is the cluster of farm buildings, which is basically the central largest building the central pile is a Dutch barn. Now I want to get into vernacular farm buildings, get away from dwellings a little bit. And this is a very folky or folksy, more formal type of structure because it's been added onto over the years. Now I don't know how old the barn is, and probably no one will ever know, because these barns, even more than houses or dwellings, are very traditional, highly traditional, because people would change their houses much more quickly than they would change their barns to keep up to date. So it was only in the late 19th century when scientific journals became readily available and became very popular that formal popular culture had an impact on most farm buildings, scientific farming and the like, and also in the way people manage their land, tilled their crops and rotated their crops and the like. Okay, so this is basically probably maybe an 18th century barn with many later buildings clustered around it. All, I'm sure, at one time or another having a very important function. This is another element of vernacular building. Form is the utmost element, or the first element of first importance. Then techniques, or technology, the technology that goes into a building, that is whether you build it in wood, whether you build it in stone, whether you build it in brick, the manner in which the joinery is done on the building, and the like. And then function is the next. Those are the three most important things in building, in vernacular building: form, techniques, and function. And the function means the manner in which people put the space in their buildings to use, and that's very important because people are very space conscious, as we all know. We need, for our psychological good, we need space. Some people can't stand to be hemmed in and become claustrophobic. Some people don't like really big spaces. They become overpowered by the wide open spaces. That happened out in our own country here on the plains when people migrated west from the east and they came out to the plains, and a lot of women and men too said, "Oh, I'm not, the sea of grass as far as the eye can see." I can't face that. That's the great American desert. Let's settle here in Missouri. And many of them did. And many of them never went beyond Missouri because they couldn't take that kind of space. It was just too vast for them. And I'm sure a lot of people feel the same way about the sea, about going out, venturing forth on the sea. So we need personal space. And there's a science connected with that. It's called proxemics. And it's very important, and it was very important in vernacular building. How do these people use the space that they had in their buildings? And it was a very important vernacular thing, traditional thing, how spaces were used. Now, again, that would be subject to change over the years. People might retain the same building and change the spatial arrangements in that building, as we're still doing today, which again is a fascinating study. Every one of us, when we come into a new house, if we buy a house or rent a house, we're going to make certain changes to suit our personalities, our personal proxemics. We're going to rearrange things because we feel more comfortable with those things rearranged. In the kitchen, we feel more comfortable if we're left-handed or right-handed, where things are hung, where utensils are kept, where our workspaces, our work surfaces are, and the like, and the kind of tools we use, stoves, refrigerators, whatever. So that's very important. And back then, say 200 years ago, it was even more important because it was so highly traditional. Today, we've been so influenced by popular media, popular culture, that we're pretty much conformed to a certain. And we can only buy, as Henry Ford said, you can have any color in Model T as long as it's black. We have a little more choice than that, a little more in the way of options. But that's one of the great dangers today. Like McDonald's, or Burger King, you can have any kind of hamburger as long as it's this, that, or the other thing. You have 3 or 4 choices. So there's a great pressure on us today to conform, to be. And we talk about being liberated and free and this whole thing, but we're not. Not by a long shot. These people 200 years ago were probably freer than we are. And that's why America was that was a big part of the American dream. Because people could do their own thing. They could have their own utopia if they so desired. Of course, it took some money too, and hard work. Another view of that same farmstead, and it's hard to visualize this as being, I guess it's North Park, or it's still high. East Park?
Actually, it's Pleasant Plains.
Pleasant Plains, okay.
Right around the corner from where I live. That's where I know.
Mm-hmm. That's a lovely landscape, and it's a fascinating cultural landscape.
Sure. They have sheep farm there, and no fences.
No?
No, there's a dog that controls their sheep.
But yeah, the dog was there, and the sheep moved away just as I was taking the picture. They were running, in fact. They finally got wind of me. This was last spring. But the Dutch barn is the nucleus of this cluster of farm buildings. I want to talk about Dutch barns. As I mentioned, field studies are very important because that's the way types are identified. That's the way typography is developed. Now, as I said, there's a pattern to all these buildings. They're not just unique instances. Commonly, they're not unique. This is a Dutch barn, a full-blown Dutch barn. And a Dutch barn consists of these components. In form, it's pretty much square. It always has the large wagon doors in the gable end. And many of the ones that have survived, and there are very few surviving in New Jersey. This is a New Jersey example. This is down the river, Barrett River Valley. Well, it isn't surviving. I understand it was torn down since I took this picture, which is really sad. But it has been recorded, which is important. Originally, the doors probably swung on wooden hinges, and they were converted, the earlier ones. And then iron strap hinges were used, and then later on sliding doors were put in, probably in the late 19th century. It's sort of from one of those scientific farm journals. Go through those large doors, and on the far end, on the other gable end, there's another set of doors, almost identical, which gives you a runway right down the center of the barn. And to the right and left of that runway, which was used as a threshing floor, it was very important when people did the hand threshing with the old flails and winnowing baskets in those days. You'd have a workspace like that, a work area. And the floors are usually pegged, very heavy, very thick boards to take that kind of flailing, or filling of the grain and other things, shucking corn, barn dances. To the right and left, these little doors, and also in the gable end, go into the stall areas. Horses were usually stabled on one side and cows on the other. This type of structure is basically an Anglo-Saxon Iron Age type of structure. And back then, in Northern Europe, in Saxony, I shouldn't say Anglo-Saxon, Saxon structure. But the dwelling was right in the barn. People lived in shared common space with the livestock and the fodder and produce from the farm. But then it was separated out, not in this country, it was separated out in Holland. And then it came over to this country as a separate structure, separate from the dwelling house. Here's a floor plan done by Henry Glassy of a barn over at Crohanson, or, well, actually Accord, Ulster County. Looking straight down from above, of course. The central doors I described in the middle. Okay, here's one central door. And here's the opposing central door on the other gable end. This signifies the roof, the ridge line here. And then those little doors on either side. This looks like some of the little feed rooms tonight. And these are the stalls would have been here, or the east. So a wagon could be, this was used as a wagon shed also when it wasn't being used for threshing from the other farmwood. And a wagon could be pulled in and the fodder could be fed into the mangers of the animals from the side of the wagon. And then the wagon would be driven out to the other end. Quite nifty, quite handy. And very ancient. And these are cultural survivors. These are really important buildings. As I say, they're basically square in plan. Now you see those little square, those represent posts that support the framework of the barn. Let's move on into that. This is that same barn that the drawing represents over the court. A later, probably 19th century addition has been added. But the basic Dutch barn is there. Notice how low the eaves are. The earlier barns usually have the lower eaves, too. And there are side doors, too, small side doors for convenience. Sometimes these were converted, of the two English type, more English type ones. Here is one of the framing components, a so-called Dutch tenon. It's C, also from Glassy's book. These illustrations are from Pattern and Material Folk Culture of the Eastern United States by Henry Glassy. They threw tenon through the post, through the vertical post, and then pegs put into the post, and then wedges into the exposed tenon, mortise and tenon. The post is mortise with a through mortise, square rectangular hole going through the post, and then the tenon, the end of the horizontal beam goes through that, and this peg in place. The wedges were used as these were usually hewn, and they were hewn when they were green because it was much easier to hew wood that way. And when they dried out, they would shrink up, and the wedges were used to adjust for that shrinkage in the joinery. The hinge is a so-called Dutch hinge, which is a very Germanic type of hinge. I've seen them down in Switzerland. Again, that Rhine River influence going down into the Delta land of the Netherlands. But the swell on the pimple end gives it that designation, Dutch hinge. Might be just as well called Dutch. This is one of those real ancient type barns that I told you about, where the dwelling of the people was the boar or yeoman, or not yeoman, boar or farmer was on the right end, and it's the threshing floor in the middle, and it's the stalls on either side of that, and the doors. Now this one doesn't have a door on the other end. Okay, now for comparative type. This is an English type barn, which is rectangular in plan, and a side opening barn. The doors are still in opposition on either side. One side, the larger side, usually was used for storage of hay in America, and the smaller side was used for the stabling of animals. That is, in this instance, there's some distortion because of the lens. The portion to the rear, to your left, would be where the animals would be stable, I think. There are doors, again, there are doors on either end, but see, the main doors are in the long side of this rectangular structure. This is an English, so-called English barn, a Yankee barn, both Dutch and English barns. I think you'd probably find, well, I don't know, you find probably about 50-50 Dutch to English barns surviving in this area. This is out on Cream Street.
The hayloft doors that are on the gable end?
Yes.
Is that traditional to put those there? And is there anything about the windows that's traditional? Because
No.
the Dutch barns seem to have little tiny windows on the long side.
Yeah. They're actually ventilators, I think. Rather than, of course, in the more scientific barns, you have the roof ventilators.
Right.
Because there was always that danger of spontaneous combustion and mildew and the like in the hay. In the Dutch barn, the hay was stored up above too in the loft, and this is I'm sure this is the 19th century. If it isn't, I haven't been in the barn. As I say, it's hard to tell, but those doors up in the hay loft are a 19th century innovation, probably late 19th century innovation. Scientific. This is a cluster of English-style barns, which belong to that house I showed you earlier that had the Calhoun house, which had the vernacular Greek Revival edition up on South Cross Road. And the English often arranged their barns in a courtyard pattern, and this is an example of that. The Yankee culture, through New England probably to New York. I don't know if they're still standing. This was taken a couple of years ago. Condition. It's disappearing. This type of thing is disappearing rapidly. This is an example of a Dutch barn on the left, and I don't know if it started out to be a Yankee barn or just some kind of a wagon shed on the right, up in North Park, also getting up towards Wittenberg.
Excuse me, you said those haylofts were 18th century? I mean, the doors in haylofts?
19th century, probably. Late 19th century. Now I want to just do a brief survey of a really fascinating area right in this locale, which is Wittenberg, off of Route 9G near Rhinebeck. This is St. Paul's Lutheran Church. It's interesting that Martin Luther came from Wittenberg originally in Germany, southwestern Germany. St. Paul's Church, built around 1802, and then enlarged around 1860. And was a focal point of a German community in this area, beginning in the 18th century. This is the newer end. This is probably the 1860 end with the steeple. Now, I don't know if it had a steeple originally. But you can see on this end, the south end, it was greatly added to. A whole couple of bays were added to the south end. And the trim is probably 1860s trim with fan lights over the doors. Italian stuff.
It's one of those photographed churches in Dutchess County.
Yeah,
because it gets lit at
very
night.
photogenic.
Beautiful.
Yes, it's a wonderful church. Now, the reason I'm showing this is I just wanted to show you what, if somebody really concentrated, or a group of people really concentrated on an area, they could get so much, such a wealth of information, of history out of this area without using some written records, but there probably aren't many written records. A problem with written records is they give an elitist slant to things, because so many people, particularly in the 18th century in this country, were illiterate. So very few of the average people kept any kind of records. So what we get is an elitist bias in records from wealthy people, wealthy educated people, which is, and that in our educations has been traditionally used to give a picture of early American life. And it's so wrong, it's so biased and so off base. But in materialized ideas, in objects, we can find, if we learn to read them, we can find a lot more information, much more information about the average person who lived back then than we can find in the written record. Granted, there were other records kept, probates of wills and land indentures and things like that. And they're important too. I'm not saying to ignore those. Those are very important in doing local history research. Very important. We need those, but we also have to look at the material remains from those early people, because they're probably the most important documents that we have to study from those early people. And every time a building goes down, without being recorded, without being studied, we lost a segment of our history, particularly our local history. And of course, national history is based on local history. You can't get away from that. All of national history. This church has blacksmith-made nails, rose-headed nails, which the blacksmith hammered, at least headed by blacksmith. And this side, this is the east side of the church, northeast corner of the church, is different from the weatherboarding on the other side. Of course, the weatherboarding on the other side shows more to the road. And people, if they didn't have a lot of money, they would do that often. I've seen houses that were built brick where they would show to the road or to the river, and then stone or some other material where they didn't show. So people would put their best foot forward, and if they didn't have the money to do it from that material all the way around, they do it to the park, on that facade that showed to the public. This may be a case with this, I don't know. These boards are also beaded, which is a step up from barn weatherboarding, barn side. Somebody took the pain to use a molding plane to put a bead on the edge of the boards. They're 1-inch boards approximately. Okay, now, right adjacent, almost hard against the church, are these several early gravestones. This one, as you can see, is dated 1763. This is a very primitive stone by a person named Michael Seeger, and it's in German. And I don't know, that the date doesn't show. It's 18th century as I remember. Oh, excuse me, date does show. But the rest of it, I think there was a little more down there. Very primitive type of stone. Nothing fancy, no symbolism or anything, just the calligraphy of the inscription and the date. Then, get into symbolism on these stones. Bas-relief carving, flowers in the stylized part, and then the calligraphy and inscriptions in German.
Same grade one?
Yes, St. Paul's, right up against the church. These are very similar to some you find down in Shenandoah Valley, Virginia, Virginia. Also heavily settled by Germans from Pennsylvania. Of course, these are Palatine Germans, probably from either the Germantown area or the Saugerties area, where they settled when they came over in the 18th century to this part. Some went out to Mohawk River Valley, the German Flats, and many of them stayed in the area because at West Camp now in Germantown, and came down into the Newburgh area, settled Newburgh region. Gravestones are really important for studying folk history, vernacular history, since these people were almost all literate. Obviously, the stone carver wasn't, but most of the people were. The thing that's important about gravestones is that everything, as I said, exists in time and space and has a form. These exist in time, they're even dated. They exist in space, they probably haven't been moved. Some well-intentioned graveyard keepers have moved stones around periodically, but usually they're kept in the same graveyard anyway. And the form is very important too, because that can be studied. The symbolism of the forms can be studied. All right, here's one symbolism. It's a very ethnic symbolism. It isn't the New England system. We know it isn't New England, because New England symbolism, the earlier symbolism was a death's head, a skull, winged skull, and then later it became a winged cherub. That is the general symbolism on New England gravestones. And then it became an urn and willow style. And I'll show you an urn, one of the New England urn and willow.
What are the flowers that are on those stones? Do you know?
I don't know.
Symbolic?
No, I don't know.
It looks like the same kind of thing that was carved on that plaque Eleanor Roosevelt that's in St. James Church.
It has something to do, the symbolism, I'm sure, has something to do with resurrection. And the heart may represent Christ. I don't know what's on, is that a thistle or something on top of the heart? I don't know, it's something on top of the heart too. But here again, if someone took the time to really go through books on German symbols in the early, say, 17th, 18th century, they could come up with a wealth of information just about the symbolism on the stone. Just in this quick, shallow survey, you can see they're radically different than many of the stones in the county, at least that I've seen. I mean, I haven't seen a great
Of course,
number.
the thing that's confusing on that is at that time they had a lot of traveling artists who did the handwork on stones and do a bunch of stones in one area and move on to another. It isn't necessarily the people themselves.
Yeah. Well, see, in New England, there's a book that identifies a lot of the carvers in different areas of New England, 17th, 18th century carvers. But this was probably a local person because it's local symbolism, I mean, it's Germanic symbolism. Granted, there were itinerant craftspeople then, but that changed more. That became more the case as time went on into the 19th century when stones became part of popular culture. They really weren't, at this stage, really, that weren't in the realm of popular culture. When it became, the person who made these stones had other skills as well. He possibly a stonemason, a carpenter, a gravestone cutter, just as he was possibly a coffin maker or whatever. Later on, gravestone cutting became a craft, and it became a livelihood, one specialization, say, by the end of the 18th century or into the 19th century. But at this time, in this area, I don't believe it was. This is a 9-year-old boy. Wonderful stone. This is a wonderful stone. I dread, a lot of people know about this, it's likely to be, not since hardly anything sacred today, it's likely to be ripped off and end up in somebody's home or antique shop, because it's really folk art. And gravestones are our earliest form of surviving folk art. They're really important. And they can, as I say, they can tell us something about the beliefs of the people who put them there. Not only who made them, but the people who had them made. And they were usually put in the ground right immediately after the person died. I just put this in to show you a traditional Dutch type of stone. This is from Marlborough on the other side of the river. This has a winged cherub. It's a highly stylized winged cherub. It isn't the New England kind. It's a real folky type of cherub. And this is a real nice stone. You find these in our county too, down at Fishkill. The Fishkill Reformed Church has some really nice sandstones, gravestones. And the stone probably came from northern New Jersey, from in the vicinity of Totowa, around the Passaic River. Much brownstone was used when there was used in construction of buildings in Manhattan, and also some brownstone came from Connecticut, but the New Jersey stone is stands up better to the weather. It's more homogeneous texture. Just for comparison with that Germanic stone. This is another stone from the St. Paul's Freehold Cemetery. And I think this one's dated 1833. The Travers are still, there's still a lot of Travers in the area, I believe. And this type of stone being made in the 1830s is anachronistic, because by this time, probably 90% of the stones were the classical urn and willow style stone. This is still a Baroque type of winged cherub stone this late, which says something about the traditions of these people, the strength of the tradition. But this is really the design for the symbolism is really probably 18th century, even mid-18th century. Just by comparison, this is a detail from an urn willow stone from Martha's Vineyard, slate stone. I forget what the date was, but it was probably the early 19th century, probably 18, I think the 1818, something like that. This is a really nice one. I shouldn't pick out all these exotic ones because, you know, the common one is just the urn with the willow tree. The thing that's important about these stones say something about the belief at this time, say the late 18th, early 19th century. The death's head symbolized death, you know. Here lies Joe or Sarah so-and-so. That's it. Winged death head, right? That's the mortality of man. The cherub came in, the cherub symbolism came in with the Great Awakening in the mid-18th century, when people started to believe in the Calvinistic belief of predestination. In other words, many people were going to be saved and go to heaven because of their belief in Christ. So then people began to use the cherub. The Puritans, they got away from the Puritan belief of the grave, you know, sort of morbidity, and the cherub symbolized more hope and resurrection and in the life to come. The Puritans somebody has written that they were iconophobic, that they didn't like that kind of symbolism, just as the Quakers didn't either. So they didn't want to have a cherub, you know, that was too hopeful. Then getting into the late 18th and early 19th century, now popular culture is coming in. Communications are getting better and people are becoming more wealthy, more affluent. The war has been won, the Revolutionary War has been won. Around this time, the war for economic independence has pretty much been won over Britain, the early 19th century. So this symbolism is really a memorial type of symbolism. Actually, in this case, as opposed to, say, the death's head gravestone, the person doesn't even have to be buried here. It's a memorial. In fact, there are some stones in New England that read, lost at sea, and give the compass points where the person was lost, but the stone is in the cemetery. It becomes a centograph. It's no longer a stating that the person is right there. It's stating that it's a memorial to that person. Right? So it's a completely different symbolism, completely different philosophy of life than, say, the early Puritan death's head or the winged cherub or even the Germanic stones we saw, which probably represent, flowers probably represent resurrection. So we can learn about the beliefs of people from these inanimate objects. Okay, now moving away from St. Paul's Church, this is a Dutch barn with added functional sheds right probably within a stone's throw of the burying ground there at St. Paul's. Remember, this is described the Dutch form. There's the large door, and this both doors and both gable ends wagon doors. And you go into that door and you see the timbering. Okay, there are the posts, the vertical posts with the large horizontal anchor beams, so-called anchor beams. Stall areas were on either side. And the threshing floor, this one has a really nice peg threshing floor too. It's people by the name of Hinky. The house is really nondescript. I haven't been in the house which is adjacent to the barn. It's a 19th century house. But this is very traditional. I'm pretty sure it's a 19th century barn. The timbering is hewn. It's all hewn. Here's another view. Looking up towards the gable end. looking south of it, or no, west of it. Each one of these posts and their anchor beams and the purlins which carry the rafters of the roof up above there to the right are called vents. Each truss is called a vent, and between each pair of vents there's a bay. So this barn, starting from the top of the door, has 1, 2, 3, 4 vents and 3 bays to make up. And notice the overhead saplings, trimmed saplings. They weren't nailed down. They were just put up there, and that was the hay loft. And you see some of the hay poking through from the loft. That's very highly traditional too. And you find that surviving today in many of these old barns. All hewn. Imagine the labor that went into constructing all these things. The clapboards or the weatherboards are sawn, probably water frames sawn up and down sawn. This is over one of what was in the Hinky barn stabling area, also used for storage. Hay in this case, but these early farmers could have stored cut grain in there too, wheat, barley, rye. So this is another view of that same barn. You can notice the 2 tenants, the Dutch Morrison tenant, and braces, bag and braces. Here's another Dutch barn in that same area. This is just a smattering of more barns up in that wooden brick area. This is a Dutch barn which has had a shed added, a couple of sheds added up at the south end. At the Naylor Farm, they sell corn down here at the intersection of St. Andrews Road and Route 9. Still an active farm for many generations. Out beyond Württemberg, about a mile and a half away, I guess, another Dutch barn which just has the smaller doors and large, probably for farm machinery storage. And a barn now down. I took this last spring and it's gone, but you can see the tenons coming through the vertical post. It was a Dutch barn. This is just a vestige of it. Okay, moving away from Württemberg, a really interesting house with a summer kitchen. These summer kitchens are a very Germanic thing. You find many of them to this day down in Pennsylvania, German area, southeastern Pennsylvania. They're called wash houses down there. When I stopped here recently, this picture was taken a couple of years ago, but I stopped back recently. There was a young man doing some work around the house, and he said, "Oh, I think that's a smokehouse." I asked him about the little structure, but I think it's a smokehouse. Well, if you look in this gable end, you can see a little square sealed-up hole. That was an oven. That was there was a brick oven there at one time, and the base is still there under the brush, briar. The house is basically a federal vernacular house with frieze windows. This is a little structure, and these are really becoming rare, particularly in this area. I found a number of them up around Germantown, but down in this area they're disappearing very quickly, those that have survived. But you can see they were really built to last. The interior, that little square part down the lower section of in the wall was where the oven was. By the way, they aren't called Dutch ovens. They were called beehive ovens because they had a little vaulted brick roof. Dutch ovens were these cast iron pots. A lot of people call these little beehive ovens Dutch ovens because they are. And the ceiling with the roofing boards and the collar beams going across were very darkened by smoke. Excuse me?
There's another one down the campus of that house. You know, you come out Stafford, the old post road,
Yes.
and you go straight up the hill.
Well, heading north?
No, they're off of 9, coming out of Stafford, and
Yes.
you go on to 9. Well, instead of turning left toward Hyder,
Yes,
you go
straight.
straight up the hill,
Mhm.
and then you come to a house that's on the corner, a white house on the hill with
Mhm.
those frieze windows.
Yes.
And back of them is
Oh, God. Yeah, I'd like to see that. Is it easily visible from the road?
Pretty much, and then you see where that's barn also.
Okay. probably passed it 1,000 times. I just want to, even though this is sort of done, you can see the large flags, the large stones that form the floor in this picture. You can see them there.
Flags?
Flag, yeah,
Oh,
flat stones, yes. And this is a partial view of the house. It has a raised basement, which is a federal conceit. During the federal period, you find, even in older houses, the kitchens are moved to the basement, and other fireplaces are installed in the basement that weren't there in the original construction. So I haven't been in this house, and we got to ask the chap if there was a fireplace in the basement, but I bet it does, or it did. Of course, these summer kitchens make cooking more comfortable in the summer and other work, washing and the like. And they're also safer because there's less danger of setting the house on fire, since people are largely cooking in open fireplaces. This just shows the proximity of the structure to the house. It's the back door, little L on the house, which is also, as I said, vernacular. This is a Dutch barn on White Schoolhouse Road, just east of Rhinebeck. And I just stumbled on this by accident. A really good Dutch barn, and it was right at the end of a roll of film, and I stopped, and there was this elderly gentleman sitting on the screened-in porch, and he had a bunch of bushels of red and green peppers sitting out in front. And I asked him, I said, gee, that's a really nice barn. Would you mind if I took a couple of pictures? It's always good to ask, although I have sort of poached on some buildings too. And he said, sure. He was surprised I wanted to take a picture, and I went in and took these pictures. And then when I came back, when I had like one picture left on my camera, he said, would you like the tour of the house? And I said, okay. And it was very interesting. He must have been a man in his 80s. And he took me through, and the house was very nondescript, the front part of the house, but the back part of the house was an early Dutch house that had been enlarged by adding on a 19th century section, which is fascinating. And that should be recorded too, because it's all part of the vernacular thing, getting up to date and making more room for your family. This is the interior of that barn. Again, the through tenons, the anchor beams going right through the posts, and then the stall areas on either side. A lot of hay stored in this barn right now. And the traditional saplings, trimmed saplings overhead. And it looks like he's put some boards over that so the hay wouldn't fall through. It's amazing how these things survive. People, I guess, just don't want to bother to take the saplings down. But some of them are floored over. Sometimes you find that Naylor barn has a floor, storage floor, progressive. Mr. Naylor's a pretty progressive guy. With modification. Another view. And of course, this barn isn't that long for this world either, just as the gentleman I spoke with. But, you know, if they can be recorded, they can be preserved for posterity, and that's really important, because people who come after us 100, 200 years from now will have that information. That's what the Historic American Building Survey was all about, and is all about, well, if it gets going again, that FDR started back in the early 30s, to preserve a documentation of the buildings. This is that one picture I had left when that elderly gentleman took me into the house. This is a really fine Dutch door, pair of Dutch doors in the house, with the fine old Dutch hinges, and the hinges haven't been taken off. Many times you find the hinges, these hinges put on, shop hinges put on with bolts with screws, which wasn't the traditional way of putting them on. The traditional technique was to put in a handmade nail with a piece of leather under it, and then clinch it on the other side of the door. And the leather, if the wood, well, it did two things. If the wood shrank a little bit, it would take up, would be a gasket that would take up that little bit of shrinkage, and also it kept the hinge from squeaking somewhat. And the leather is still under the nails. It feels like metal now, it's so old and hardened. So I plan to go back. I asked him if I could come back sometime and do some more. Move along. This is a wonderful document now in the collection of the New York State Historical Association in Cooperstown. It's often used by architectural historians and curators. It was an overmantel That is a decorative board that was placed over a mantel in a house that stood near Leeds, New York, up in Greene County. The theory is that it was done around the mid-18th century, around 1750. And it shows a Dutch farmstead with the Catskill Mountains in the background. It was the Van Bergen house. Now there's still a Van Bergen homestead up there, which had a wonderful Dutch barn until recently when it collapsed. She even had a New York State Historic marker by it, but it wasn't preserved. But fortunately, it has been measured and drawn.
Right by the road there.
Yes, yes, right by that little
That's what
side.
that's on.
Yes. Anyway, the thing that's important about this depiction is it shows a Dutchess type house with the end chimneys and a little wing on it. Probably. Well, sometimes these houses were built. It's hard for us to visualize how small many of these colonial houses were originally, and sometimes only one room on the first floor, and whole families, sometimes 5 or 6 children lived in this one room, and that's still the case in parts of the world. And I have friends who live in Ireland, and they say that's the case in parts of Ireland, more primitive areas of Ireland. But people, they're against proxemics, they're able to maintain their privacy because people respect each other. If people are undressing or dressing or whatever, they look the other way out of common decent courtesy and that kind of thing. So it's really interesting. It's hard for us to visualize that now. But usually these houses, many times people lived in dugouts for years before they were able to build a house, and then when the house was built, it was a very small house. And then, oftentimes, when the people prospered and their families got larger, they would build a bigger house, added to that little house, and we think the little wing is in addition to the big house, right? But usually it's just the reverse, especially in Dutch vernacular culture. Well, anyway, this may be the case here. Notice there's a Dutch barn, it's very general, ambiguous in the background. Then there are these 2 interesting structures in the foreground, in front of the Dutch barn. The road that went by that house I just showed with the little summer kitchen was originally called Barracks Road. So I'm almost certain there were barracks on that road at one time. There's a Star Barrack Road up around Germantown that I've been on. These are barracks, and what they are a rudimental form of barn. They were brought over, they still exist in Holland, mainly in museums and outdoor museums, but they were brought over to this country by the early Dutch settlers. And they were built on the frontier because they were very easy to erect, very economical to erect, and they were very practical. The one on the left has the cut grain, straw, or hay in it. And the one on the right, does the one on the right, but the one on the right has space underneath. And these were practical because they could either be used strictly for grain, hay storage, or they could be used to store as a hay mow or hay rick, with space underneath to stable animals, and oftentimes that space underneath was boarded up to keep animals out of the weather, until the people could afford to build a barn. And building a barn was a big enterprise, and it was costly. It took a lot of time, a lot of labor, and money to build a barn. I've only found one of these surviving in New York, and I pray, and I think there are others surviving, hopefully somewhere. I haven't really gotten around the Mohawk River Valley that much. But I haven't found anyone who knows of any more. Let me just say something about the history. These also go way back to the Middle Ages, at least. This is a Rembrandt etching out in the British Museum showing a thatched cottage and a hay barrack. This one has 6 poles with a hay wagon under it. That's 1640.
This is, in the Mohawk Valley?
No, it isn't. I'll show you some slides of it short. That's close enough. This is I think a 1703 depiction of a Dutch farmstead with a hay barrack or barrack. When you see Barracks Road, you think right away of the military barracks. I guess the military barracks, maybe the original soldiers slept in these. That's where they came from. I don't know. I'm sure the original barracks, such as they were, very crude too, military. It shows the dwelling and the barn. I think in this case the barn is a part of the dwelling. Large chimney with a deflector, the cap to probably keep the sparks from setting the thatched roof on fire. And another shed also, so against the barrack. This is the only barrack that I found in New York surviving. And I went and found the owner, his farm about half a mile away, and he thought it was unique. Well, it is unique. So far in New York State, it is surviving. This is the landscape. This is up at Livingston, up near Blue Stores, looking west. And you can just see a little square thing there to the right side of the road, which in that picture was filled with hay. This was a couple of years ago. This is it. It's still being used, and as I say, the farmer thought it was unique. You would never see another one. Notice the holes in the corner post. And I'll explain what that was for in a minute. It has a very light pyramidal roof, lightly framed. Here's the underside of the roof. And it keeps it in repair. And it was there when he's been living there 45 years, and it was there when his family moved there. The interesting thing about these structures is that oftentimes they were built in this century, but the tradition was, because the tradition was so strong, the early Middle Age tradition, as with the Dutch barns, they were still being constructed.
So the number of sides isn't, you can have a six-sided.
Well, in this I've only found the four-sided.
Yeah.
I've only found square ones.
Yeah.
This one's approximately 18 foot square. I did an article on these for Pioneer America a few years ago. And this is
That's raising
sketch,
the roof.
this is a sketch I did. Actually, it took two people. I should have drawn another man up on the ladder. I've never
looks
seen
like
this.
he's hanging.
Through oral history, I've heard this described from gentlemen in their 70s, but I've never seen it. There is a photograph or two showing people doing this. This is why the posts are drilled, where there are holes in the posts, and why the roof is so light. The advantage of this kind of structure was that they could raise and lower the roof, depending on how much they wanted to store inside. This depicts a man in the process of raising the roof. And this was done by putting a metal pin through this long bar, which is called a sweep, like a well sweep. This is the traditional nomenclature from the gentleman down in New Jersey. Putting it through the hole, one of the lower holes. That's why the holes go all the way down to the bottom of the post, by the way, too. In the lower, and then using what was called a temple. There are different length spacers to raise each corner of the roof, and they go around to all four posts and raise one corner a notch at a time, or maybe two notches, depending on how heavy the roof was. And they work it all the way up that way. And there are just, I don't think you see pins, but there are metal pins sticking out in the hole, holding the corner of the roof up, the corners of the roof up. See those? Tried to show. The fulcrum for all that was a pin down, that went through the sweep. And a notch was cut into the end of the sweep to take the temple. And sometimes a horseshoe was put in that to keep the temple from kicking off.
What was your article?
Past. Proceedings of the Pioneer America Society transactions. And it was based on a lecture I gave out in Ohio back in 1977 on barracks. This is the same barracks filled with hay. Thing in front of you, give you an idea of the scale. So it's still being used, which is wonderful. Now, interestingly enough, this is the only one of these I found in New Jersey, I found in New York State, but I found a number of them in New Jersey. You find more Dutch barns in New York State than you find in New Jersey surviving. This is a farmstead right near my home area in northern New Jersey. This is in Morris County, Tuaco. This is a farmstead owned by a family named Van Ness, and they've been there for 8 generations, and they're still working the farm. One of the holdouts down in that area, as you can well imagine. Now, if you look very closely, you can see these are really in sad condition, and they're really great barracks. There are 2 barracks to the right of the picture, just before you get to that light colored roof building with the red gable in. I'll show you a nearer view, really highly traditional with pyramidal roofs. And I'm sure thatch went out as it did on barns very early because of the climate, the North American climate. Climate has an influence on traditional architecture too. It can modify some of the traditions that were brought over from the Netherlands or from England or wherever, France. These were usually built in pairs, again as in the Dutch barn, so a wagon could be driven right between them, and the loading could be done off of either side of the wagon. And that's just the way, these are about 16 feet square. And you rarely find them surviving in pair. I think this is the only pair I've found surviving, but at one time it was quite common to have pairs of them. There were originally 3 surviving up until a few years ago on this farm, and they took one down and put another greenhouse before I got there, unfortunately. And here again, it's, I didn't really know about these things until about 8 years ago. And it's out of ignorance, you don't know a lot of times you don't know what you're seeing. I mean, they're really rare. They're almost like hen's teeth, these vernacular. And they're very rare, but if you don't know what you're looking at, I didn't even know they were there. I mean, I've been up and down this road many times, too.
They raise and lower that?
No, this one hasn't been raised and
Station.
lowered in years and years and years. There's cedar posts, just trimmed cedar posts driven into the ground, and they're well preserved. Cedar has a natural oil, like redwood, which is in its own family. So it preserves them. Sometimes the bases were burned before charred before they were put in the ground to help protect them from rot.
How tall are those risers? The 4 posts?
I think about 20 feet. I don't know. I didn't measure them really. I just gauged them by my height. I'm just 6 feet tall. Roughly 20 feet. And this is a detail of what's left of the better one. Showing the pins supporting the corners of the roof. And the roof has been probably replaced once or twice too over the years. You can see how, it's kind of hard to see, but the sheathing of the roof is very thin, very light, scant. Make it as light as possible and still keep the weather away from the produce. Okay. This is getting back to that farm I showed initially. I haven't really used my notes very much on this. Let me go over
That's in Quaker Lane.
Yes, this is Quaker Lane, and that's the same house I showed right at the beginning, that story-and-a-half, 2-room deep house with the frieze windows. And there's a Dutch barn, and I was just in that barn recently, and there's hardly anything left of the original barn. A lot of it rotted out, which is often the case, and Dutch barns were built at ground level. There was usually no basement at all, and they're just built, they were just put down stones here and there to support the weight of the sills and the superstructure. Then they would put their sills, mortise and tenon sills, right on those stones, and the sleepers that they used for planking for the floor of the barn. And then they would build their peg frame up from that. Their vents would go up from that platform. Often it's similar to the way balloon frame houses are built today. You know, where people build a deck and then they go up from the deck with the rest of the superstructure. So it's similar, but it's a peg frame building. Balloon frame buildings are supported, the skin supports the framework. In other words, the sheathing on a balloon frame, modern type of construction, house construction, the sheathing supports the framework. On this type of structure, the framework supports the sheathing. The sheathing is just the skin laid on, as in high-rise buildings or in skyscrapers. The framework is, steel framework is fatigue, and the skin, the window walls are attached to the steel framework. Well, the steel framework on a skyscraper is the same, basically rudimentarily the same type of technology used in the barn or peg frame, any kind of peg frame build. I don't know how much time we have left. Do you want to go just to 11? Okay. Well, I'm going to just zip through.
Or whatever.
You'd like some time for
Well,
questions?
yeah, we want some time for questions, and Matt's going to show us some of the stone walls too. Yeah, we
Oh,
want to
okay,
finish this.
okay.
We'll finish
All right,
this.
well, I don't have to show these because this is just an adjunct to what I want to talk about mainly.
No, we have time.
Okay, this is a house that I've been somewhat involved with recently, and it's out near the Amy house. Neither the Amy house nor this house, this is the Hall Christie house out at the Clove Valley, I think in this case, were included in the county landmarks book back in 1969. And these are two really important vernacular houses for the county. But people don't really understand vernacular buildings. They understand them if some worthy person, some prominent figure or wealthy person lived in the building, or if it's an outstanding academic type of house like Macefield up in Red Hook, which is a wonderful brick federal house. But most people don't understand about vernacular houses because they're hardly studied, because they're very esoteric in ways.
I have a copy of the rough outline of about 300 houses they did before that book.
A lot of them had to be dropped in the
I
book.
think those houses, both of the ones you mentioned, were in it.
Okay, you initialed the original.
I have no knowledge at all of how they selected
Yes,
one.
yes,
I
yes.
didn't participate in that.
Yeah, well, they had categories for selection, I know, the way the book is organized.
Yeah.
Now, if that, again, if that data exists, maybe another book can be brought out showing more. Ulster County did their landmarks, but they showed more vernacular structure. And
Well,
Dutchess County.
Ulster had a total of about 1,900 houses in their preliminary
My goodness.
layout.
Yeah, gee, that's really, I'll have to talk to Stephanie Mard about that, because if that information, more information exists, I was unaware of it. It should really be made public, even by the County Historical Society.
That might be a focus for they're looking for something to do, to get people involved in it. That might be something to focus for the preservation, to get them
Yes.
involved in it, put out another
Yes.
edition.
See, Ulster County has a lot of surviving 18th century stone houses. Well, we have a lot of surviving stone frame brick 18th century houses. But because of Huguenot Street and New Falls and some of the other areas, Marbletown, Curly, they get a little more vernacular exposure than we do in Dutchess County. Even though we have houses that are just as good, if not better, vernacular houses than Ulster County has. And I like Ulster County. I mean, I've done a lot of research over there, Ulster and Orange. But a lot of people don't take vernacular architecture seriously unless it looks like stone has a certain aura of antiquity to it. Even a modern stone house, there's something about stone that's so permanent, the Rock of Ages. And people tend to take that more serious than an old frame house for some reason. It's more romantic. But this is the Hall Christie house, and this, in looking at it, basically, it's a Cape Cod house, central chimney, New England Cape Cod style house. And actually, a Cape Cod house is sort of a vernacular Georgian too. This is a story and a half, I won't get into that, but most Cape Cod houses are like one story. And sometimes they're full Cape Cod, sometimes they're partial. It is with Georgian houses too. You can have a breakdown of the segments of this plan of the house. But when you see this house closer, well, I'll just show you some outside. It's a salt box design, but it's a story and a half now. It isn't one story. It's a story and a half in front. Remember I said that story and a half design is a Dutchy type of thing. And then it has a lean-to off the back with the same pitch, roof pitch, the continuous roof pitch. That is the roof pitch. This is a view of the north end of the roof. Shingled, but the original house was collaborative with wide weatherboard. A lot of work was done in this house back, I think, around the 1920s or 30s. This is the, oh gosh, what's the west side of the house? These pictures were taken earlier in the morning. And there was a later 20th century L. Well, actually, I think there were two L's. There was an earlier L and there was a 20th century L service kitchen area, which is collapsed. And just adjacent to the house, of course, is the surviving necessary with the lower seat for children, which is also important. The way the outhouse and toilet is placed in relation to the house's space and the layout of the toilet, as well as any other auxiliary structures, smokehouses, barns, summer kitchen. When you get inside the house, excuse me, it has wonderful paneling. This house is threatened right now, by the way, by the Sportsman's Club out there. They want to tear it down and make off-road parking for the fishermen, because there's a wonderful trout stream right behind the house. And but the wonderful New England style, as the exterior design of the house is a New England form, English, basically an English form. The paneling is also New England. But then when you start looking at the timbering, it's Dutch vernacular. And the thing that's really fascinating about this house is that it's an amalgam of both Dutch and English vernacular traditions. The building, the framing itself is all Dutch, but then there are, as I say, the form, the floor plan is basically English. It's a little vestibule, as Cape Cod houses have, as many New England 17th century houses have. The stairway isn't off of the vestibule. The stairway, going to the second floor, the main stairway, is basically a Dutch enclosed stairway, which you're seeing here. The exposed beams, whenever you see these exposed beams that run the full depth of the house, that's Dutch framing. English framing has a big summer beam that runs usually parallel with the ridge line, ridge pole, and then smaller joists intersecting with that, with the summer beam at right angles. That's English framing. Dutch framing has these large, they're really girder joists that run the full depth of the house, and they're spanned by the flooring. And when they're left exposed, they are always beautifully finished. They're never rusticated. They're always smooth. They're always hand hewn and then planed on corner, and all times beaded or a bead is put on with the plane also. I think these are beaded in this house, because these people were craftsmen and they were makers, and when they made something, they wanted it to last and they wanted it to look nice. I've seen people who've taken people down in New Jersey took a Dutch house which had this kind of timbering and rusticated